Welcome to Fireside History. Today we tell you the story of a rivalry that forged a nation. We go back to President Washington's first cabinet. There, two of the brightest minds of their time share a table, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. But they are not allies, but irreconcilable enemies. Each one has a completely opposite vision for the future of the United States. Their personal conflict would shape the soul of the country. Their animosity and deep ideological disagreements created the first political parties. How exactly did this happen? This confrontation defined the foundations of American democracy. Let's begin with today's story. To understand Alexander Hamilton, one must not look at the grand mansions of Virginia. One must travel to a small, humble Caribbean island. He was born out of wedlock and became an orphan very young. His childhood was a constant struggle for survival in a world that seemed to have no place for him. This experience did not break him. On the contrary, it forged in him an iron ambition and an insatiable hunger for order. Hamilton was a hurricane of energy and intellect, determined to leave his mark on the world. He saw in the American Revolution the perfect opportunity, not only to fight for a country, but to build one from scratch. During the war, he became George Washington's right-hand man. From that privileged position, he closely witnessed the inefficiency of a decentralized government. He saw a weak Continental Congress, unable to pay or equip its own soldiers. For him, the lesson was brutally clear. Liberty without a strong central power was simply anarchy. That is why his vision for the United States was radically different from that of many of his contemporaries. He wanted a powerful federal government, capable of uniting the 13 states into a single cohesive and stable nation. And to achieve this, he had a very detailed economic plan. Hamilton believed that the greatness of a country was not in its farmlands, but in its workshops and markets. He pushed for the creation of an economy based on manufacturing, trade, and finance. He admired the British model, with a national bank to stabilize the currency and a system that favored entrepreneurs and creditors. The irony is striking: to fight against an empire only to then want to copy its economic system. For Hamilton, it was simple pragmatism. He believed the country should be governed by an elite of educated, propertied men. He did not trust the masses. He thought common people were too impulsive to make rational decisions. In his mind, a strong government led by the best was the only guarantee of stability and progress. This was the man, and this, his ambitious vision. And in the other corner of the ideological ring, we have Thomas Jefferson. His world was not that of Hamilton's humble Caribbean. Jefferson was a Virginia aristocrat, a man of land, books, and privilege. He was the personification of the Southern Enlightenment. Jefferson was a man of ideas. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, a document that breathes idealism and an almost poetic faith in individual liberty. His trust in the common people was absolute. While Hamilton forged his vision of power on the battlefield, Jefferson was in Paris as a diplomat. There he was a direct witness to the fervor of the French Revolution. He returned to America convinced that the greatest danger was not chaos, but the tyranny of an oppressive government. Therefore, his deepest fear was precisely what Hamilton most desired: a strong federal government. Jefferson saw in that centralized power the germ of a new monarchy, a betrayal of the ideals for which they had fought. For him, power ought to reside in the states, and above all, in the people. His economic vision was the perfect reflection of his philosophy. He dreamed of an agrarian republic, a nation of small, independent farmers. He believed that those who worked their own land were the most virtuous, incorruptible, and truly free citizens. But what about Hamilton's economy, his bankers, speculators, and industrialists? For Jefferson, these were the parasites of a healthy society, the same ones who corrupted European governments. He wanted strong ties with revolutionary France, not with monarchical Great Britain that Hamilton admired. Jefferson did not trust the elites. He trusted the farmer, the artisan, the common citizen. His ideal was a government so small and discreet that it was barely noticeable, an absolute contrast to the centralized and powerful economic engine that Hamilton was determined to build. In 1789, George Washington formed his first cabinet. The idea was brilliant and, on paper, infallible: to gather the sharpest minds of the nation to build the future. A team of stars destined to govern with wisdom and unity. What could go wrong? Well, almost everything. Because in that very room, Washington seated his two most important secretaries face to face. Alexander Hamilton, at the head of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State. It was like bringing together fire and gunpowder and expecting them to simply decorate the room. Cabinet meetings quickly turned into an intellectual battlefield. We can imagine the scene. Hamilton, energetic and direct, presenting his plans for a centralized economy with a speed that left everyone breathless. Jefferson, calmer but with a steely gaze, refuting each point with philosophical arguments about liberty and tyranny. These were not cordial debates between colleagues. They were head-on collisions. The tension was so palpable that the other cabinet members often simply observed, as if they were in the front row of a duel. Every proposal from Hamilton was, for Jefferson, a step towards monarchy. Every defense of states' rights by Jefferson was, for Hamilton, an invitation to anarchy. And amidst it all, an increasingly exasperated Washington. The great general who had defeated an empire now found himself in the role of arbiter between his two most brilliant and stubborn subordinates. He listened to both, read their furious reports, and tried to find a middle ground. He often felt that his true job was not to lead a country, but a nursery for geniuses. The conflict was inevitable due to the nature of their positions. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, needed federal power to create a stable financial system from scratch. Jefferson, as Secretary of State, sought to protect state sovereignty and manage the delicate relationship with revolutionary France. Their own jobs put them on a direct collision course. That cabinet table became the epicenter of the earthquake that was to come. The philosophical differences that defined them were about to leave the world of ideas. Soon they would transform into concrete political battles over the very soul of the nation. The first great fight was just around the corner. The first great cannon shot in this ideological war was fired by Hamilton in early 1790. He presented to Congress his report on public credit, a document that would shake the foundations of the young nation. His plan was audacious, almost brazen. He proposed that the new federal government assume all the state's war debts. We are talking about a gigantic sum for the time, approximately $25 million. For Hamilton, the logic was impeccable. A serious nation pays its debts. By doing so, the government would demonstrate its solvency to the world, attracting investments and securing its future. But there was something more, a stroke of political genius. Creditors, the rich and influential people who held those debt bonds, would no longer look to their states for payment. Their economic loyalty would transfer directly to the federal government. It was a brilliant way to tie the elites and the states to a strong central power. In the South, the proposal landed like a bombshell. Thomas Jefferson and his new ally in Congress, James Madison, saw it as a tyrannical maneuver. Their home state, Virginia, had already paid most of its war debt with great effort. Why should they now pay for the mistakes of other less responsible states? It seemed to them a blatant injustice, a financial bailout for the northern states at the expense of the disciplined South. The perception was that a system was being created to benefit a few. And there was a detail that smelled particularly bad. During the years of uncertainty after the war, many soldiers, desperate for money, had sold their government pay certificates. They sold them for a pittance to wealthy speculators, mainly from the north. Now Hamilton's plan proposed to pay the full value of those certificates. The speculators who had risked nothing would become fabulously rich. Meanwhile, the veterans who had given everything were left with nothing. The battle was no longer theoretical. It was a fight for money, regional power, and the very definition of justice in the new republic. Hamilton's plan was stuck in Congress. Political paralysis was total, and threatened to fracture the country before it could even begin to walk. The atmosphere in Philadelphia was unbearable. The nation peered into its first great abyss. It was then that one of the most famous dinners in United States history occurred. According to Thomas Jefferson himself, in June 1790, he decided to intervene. He invited Hamilton and James Madison to his residence for dinner. We can imagine the scene. Three men who represented opposing visions of the country. They were seated at the same table with a good bottle of wine and the future of the nation in their hands. It was not a dinner among friends. It was a high-voltage negotiation. There, between courses, the so-called Compromise of 1790 was forged. The agreement was pure political pragmatism. Madison committed to securing the Southern votes necessary to approve Hamilton's debt assumption plan. He would stop blocking the proposal in Congress. In exchange, Hamilton would work his magic with the Northern congressmen. He would convince them to support an idea very dear to the South. The nation's permanent capital would not be in the North, neither in Philadelphia nor in New York. A new federal city would be built in the South, on the banks of the Potomac River. It was an immense symbolic and political victory for Jefferson and his supporters. The agreement worked perfectly. In July 1790, Congress approved the Residence Act. This act established the new capital in the South. Shortly thereafter, the Funding Act was approved to launch Hamilton's economic plan. The crisis had been averted. The pact demonstrated that, despite their animosities, these men were capable of negotiating for a greater good. Hamilton barely had time to savor his victory with the debt plan. He was not a man to rest on his laurels. The truce of the Compromise of 1790 was just that, a brief pause before the next assault. In December 1790, he presented his report on a national bank to Congress. If his previous plan was a cannon shot, this was heavy artillery. The proposal was of unprecedented audacity. He wanted to create the Bank of the United States. Its design was inspired, to the utter horror of his opponents, by the Bank of England. It would not be a purely governmental institution. It would be a public-private partnership. The federal government would be the main shareholder, owning 20% of the shares. The remaining 80% would be in the hands of private investors. The bank would have a license to operate for 20 years. Its initial capital would be $10 million, a figure so gigantic for the time that it almost seemed abstract. But what purpose would this financial colossus serve? Hamilton explained it with his usual clarity. Firstly, it would be the government's fiscal agent. It would guard collected taxes and facilitate payments. The logistical chaos of managing public money would end. Secondly, and this was revolutionary, the bank could issue paper money. It would create a single and stable national currency that would replace the confusing mosaic of state bills and foreign coins. Finally, a dollar would be a dollar in Georgia and in Massachusetts. And thirdly, it would provide credit. It would grant loans to merchants and entrepreneurs to finance new ventures. It would be the engine that would drive the industrial and commercial economy he so yearned for. The economic objective was evident, but the political objective was even deeper. By selling shares to the wealthiest citizens, Hamilton directly linked them to the success of the federal government. Their personal fortunes would depend on the nation's stability. For Jefferson, this was not a plan to strengthen the economy. It was the plan to create an aristocracy of money, a serpent that would infiltrate the government and corrupt the republic from its foundations. The battle was about to begin. The proposal for a national bank fell upon Jefferson like a declaration of war. For him, this was no longer a simple disagreement over economic policy. It was a fundamental betrayal, a direct assault on the document he considered sacred, the Constitution. Alongside James Madison, who was now his primary ally in Congress, he prepared the counteroffensive. His argument was not based on whether the bank was good or bad for the economy. It was based on a much deeper question. Was it legal? His answer was a resounding no. Jefferson championed what we today know as a strict interpretation of the Constitution. His logic was crystal clear. The federal government only has the powers explicitly granted to it in the document. If a power is not on the list, the government simply does not have it. And upon reviewing Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where the powers of Congress are enumerated, Jefferson and Madison found not a single word authorizing the creation of a bank or any other private corporation. Not a single mention. End of discussion. To cap off their argument, they turned to the 10th Amendment of the recently ratified Bill of Rights. This clearly states that any power not delegated to the federal government is reserved for the states. The creation of banks, therefore, was a state matter, not a federal one. Jefferson did not limit himself to debating this in private. He drafted a formal opinion and delivered it directly to President Washington. In it, he declared that the law to create the bank was unconstitutional. The message was clear and forceful. Signing that law would be violating the pact that united the nation. The battle had shifted ground. It was no longer about finances. It was about the limits of power. Washington now found himself in an impossible position, trapped between the two most brilliant minds of his cabinet. He had to make a decision that would define the scope of the federal government forever. President Washington had a very serious problem. In one hand, he had Jefferson's report. It was a legally impeccable argument that declared the bank proposal unconstitutional. In the other hand, he had the nation's economic future. Distressed, he did the only thing he could do. He handed Jefferson's document to Hamilton and asked him for a response. He gave him a week. Hamilton was unfazed. This was his home turf. He locked himself away and, instead of writing a simple refutation, produced a 15,000-word masterpiece, a legal treatise that would forever change the interpretation of the Constitution. His argument was brilliant. He admitted that the Constitution did not explicitly state Congress can create a bank. But, according to him, that wasn't the point. The Constitution was not an instruction manual with every step detailed. It was a document that granted general powers to govern. This is where Hamilton unleashed his secret weapon. He focused on a phrase in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the clause that gives Congress the power to make all laws that are necessary and proper for executing its powers. So, what did this mean? Hamilton explained it devastatingly. If the government has the explicit power to collect taxes and regulate commerce, then it must also have the implied power to create the tools to do so effectively. A bank, he argued, was not just useful, it was a necessary and proper tool. This was the first articulation of the doctrine of implied powers. With it, Hamilton not only defended his bank, he opened a door that enormously expanded the authority of the federal government. The government was not limited only to what was written. It could do whatever was convenient to achieve its objectives. Washington now had two opposing visions on the table: Jefferson's, which sought to limit federal power, and Hamilton's, which sought to unleash it. The decision was his. George Washington faced an impossible choice. On his desk lay two visions of the future, each defended by an intellectual giant. Jefferson offered him a limited government, faithful to the letter of the Constitution. Hamilton proposed an energetic government, capable of adapting and growing. The decision was not just about a bank. It was about the very soul of American government. Should it be a passive guardian of liberties or an active engine of national progress? In the end, Washington's pragmatism, forged in the harsh years of war, prevailed. He had personally suffered the paralysis of a weak central power. Hamilton's logic, though bold, offered him a clear path toward a strong, united, and financially solvent nation. Jefferson's argument, though noble, seemed to him a risk that the young and fragile republic could not afford. On February 25, 1791, the president took his pen and signed the law. With one stroke, the Bank of the United States became a reality. For Hamilton, it was the most important victory of his career. His vision of a modern economy and robust federal power was no longer a dream. It was the law of the land. He had won. For Jefferson, it was a devastating defeat. He saw in Washington's signature proof that his worst nightmare was coming true. The federal government had broken its constitutional chains. For him, the republic had taken its first and fateful step toward tyranny. The battle over the bank had ended, but this defeat sowed a seed. Jefferson and Madison realized that cabinet discussions were no longer enough. If they wanted to stop Hamilton, they needed to organize a formal and public opposition. The ideological war was about to enter a new phase, one that would forever change American politics. A small aside. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. Peace in Washington's cabinet lasted less time than candy at a school gate. Just as the waters calmed after the battle over the bank, news arrived from Europe that set everything ablaze again. The French Revolution, which had initially filled many Americans with hope, had turned dark and bloody. The initial idealism drowned in the so-called Reign of Terror. Heads rolled by the thousands on the guillotine, including that of King Louis XVI. And then, in February 1793, revolutionary France declared war on Great Britain. This news crossed the Atlantic and exploded in Philadelphia like a veritable bomb. This was a catastrophic problem for a very simple reason. There was a document signed in 1778, the Franco-American Alliance Treaty. That paper was the reason France had helped the United States win its independence. And it contained a very clear clause. The United States was obligated to defend French possessions in America if they were attacked. The young nation found itself trapped at an impossible crossroads. On one hand, there was honor. Turning its back on the ally that helped it be born would be a shameful betrayal. On the other hand, there was survival. Going to war against Great Britain, the world's greatest naval power, was economic and military suicide. The country was too young, too fragile, and too poor to survive such a conflict. America faced a terrible question. Which path should it take? This dilemma immediately became the new personal battlefield between Hamilton and Jefferson. For Jefferson, eternally enamored with France, the idea of abandoning his revolutionary brethren was unthinkable. It was a matter of principles. For Hamilton, the pragmatist who saw Great Britain as an indispensable commercial partner, the idea of going to war over a treaty signed with a dead king was absolute madness. The survival of the nation was above all else. The diplomatic storm was about to break, and this time, the consequences could be fatal. For Thomas Jefferson, the news arriving from France was not a disaster. It was the echo of chains breaking. He had lived in Paris. He had felt the energy of the revolution in its early stages. Where others saw the chaos of the Reign of Terror, he saw the painful spasms of the birth of a sister republic. His support was not only political, it was deeply personal and philosophical. The idea of abandoning the Treaty of 1778 seemed to him an act of legalistic cowardice. The argument that the pact had been made with a now executed king was, for him, an absurd excuse. Jefferson was very clear on this. Treaties are signed between nations, not between temporary governments. The French people were still there, and those people were fighting for the same principles that had inspired American independence. For him, this went beyond a simple document. It was a matter of ideological survival for republicanism worldwide. If the French Republic fell, crushed by European monarchies, the American one would become a solitary and vulnerable island. They would be alone in an ocean of kings. Supporting France was, therefore, protecting their own future. Furthermore, there was the question of honor. France had been their first and most crucial ally. Without French aid, the American Revolution could have failed spectacularly. Turning their back on them now, just when they needed it most, was a monstrous ingratitude. It would be like helping a friend escape from prison, only to then close the door behind you. Hamilton's stance, favorable to Great Britain, was repugnant to him. To even consider siding with their former oppressor was unthinkable. How could they betray their first and most loyal friend? His policy was clear and unwavering. The United States had to honor its word, support the cause of liberty, and direct all its diplomacy in favor of revolutionary France. For Alexander Hamilton, the news from Paris was not the sound of chains breaking. They were the cries of a maddened mob and the screech of the guillotine. His vision of the French Revolution was far from romantic. It was a horror show. Chaos, anarchy, and mob rule were the embodiment of his worst fears. He saw in France not a sister republic, but a warning of what happens when fanaticism is unleashed. But his opposition was not only philosophical. It was, as always with Hamilton, brutally pragmatic. His main argument could fit into an accounting ledger. Go to war against Great Britain. It would be economic suicide. More than 90% of goods imported into the United States came from British ships. Tariffs on those imports were the federal government's main source of revenue. That money was the fuel that powered his entire financial system. It paid the interest on the national debt and gave credibility to the new nation. Declaring war on your main trading partner and banker was, in his opinion, the stupidest idea imaginable. It would be like setting your own house on fire to warm your neighbors. And if the economic argument wasn't enough, Hamilton had a legal one up his sleeve. The 1078 Treaty. He maintained it was a dead letter. That agreement was signed with the government of King Louis XVI, but that government no longer existed. In fact, the people who now governed France had cut off that king's head. Therefore, the treaty was legally dead. There was no obligation to uphold it. It was a cold, calculating but legally defensible way out. For him, the choice was obvious. Neither honor nor loyalty to distant revolutions. The only priority was the survival and stability of the United States. That's why he strongly pressed Washington to renounce the treaty and declare strict neutrality. America first and foremost. Once again, Washington's cabinet became a battlefield. But this time there was no time for philosophical debates. The war in Europe demanded an immediate response, and the future of the nation hung by a thread. Washington listened to the impassioned arguments of his two secretaries. On one side, the loyalty and honor that Jefferson requested. On the other, the cold and calculating pragmatism of Hamilton. The choice was not easy, but the president was, above all, a general. He had seen up close the nation's fragility and was unwilling to risk it. In the end, Hamilton's logic prevailed. On April 22, 1793, Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. The document was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity. It declared that the United States would be friendly and impartial towards the warring powers. It forbade American citizens from taking sides in the conflict. The words were carefully neutral, but the message was brutally clear. In practice, it completely ignored the 1778 Treaty of Alliance. The United States was not going to come to France's aid. Economic survival was above old pacts. For Jefferson, the news was a devastating blow. It was not just a political defeat. It was a personal and moral betrayal. He saw how the nation turned its back on its first friend to flirt with its former tyrant. In his mind, this confirmed his worst suspicions. Hamilton was not only winning the economic battle, he now also controlled foreign policy. The proclamation did not bring peace to the cabinet, quite the opposite. It deepened the rift between the two men, making it insurmountable. Jefferson felt increasingly isolated within an administration that, in his eyes, was dangerously leaning towards the British model. His disillusionment was total, and that disillusionment would soon turn into action. Defeated and increasingly marginalized in the cabinet, Thomas Jefferson understood one thing. The battles behind closed doors were no longer enough. He was losing the war within the government. So he decided to take it outside, to the public square. For this, he needed a new and powerful weapon. That weapon was the press. In the 18th century, newspapers were not impartial sources of news. They were tools of political combat, designed to shape public opinion, promote an agenda, and destroy the opponent. And in this field, Hamilton had a considerable advantage. The Secretary of the Treasury discreetly supported the Gazette of the United States, edited by John Fenno. This newspaper was, in practice, the mouthpiece of the administration. Its pages were full of praise for Hamilton's policies, presenting him as a visionary genius who was saving the nation. Jefferson and Madison decided it was time to fight with the same weapons, but they could not do it openly. So, in secret, they contacted a poet and journalist named Philip Freneau. They made him an irresistible offer to move to Philadelphia and found a rival newspaper. To ensure Freneau had a stable salary, Jefferson gave him a part-time job as a translator in the Department of State. That is, he used public funds from his own department to finance a journalist whose sole mission was to attack the government of which he was a part. The irony was delicious. Thus, the National Gazette was born in 1791, and with it, the War of the Gazettes erupted. The attacks were brutal and personal. Hamilton's newspaper painted Jefferson's followers as dangerous radicals, Jacobins, who wanted to import the bloody chaos of France. For its part, Freneau's newspaper did not hold back. It described Hamilton as an aspiring monarch, a corrupt individual sold out to British speculators and bankers. The ideological battle had left the elegant salons to become a black and white, mudslinging fight. The entire nation was reading and taking sides. The War of the Gazettes was not just ink on paper. It was a call to arms for public opinion. Every incendiary article and every scathing caricature forced citizens to take sides. The debate was no longer confined to a cabinet room. It was now waged in every tavern and every home. Little by little, what had begun as an informal circle of allies began to organize. Hamilton's supporters, who met in salons and wrote in defense of the government, began to be known as the Federalists. The name was perfect. It reflected their fundamental belief in a strong and centralized federal government. Their platform was, in essence, Hamilton's agenda transformed into a national movement. They supported the bank, the assumption of debt, and an economy based on commerce and industry. In foreign policy, they favored ties with Great Britain, not out of love for the monarchy, but out of pure commercial pragmatism. For them, order and stability were the foundation of progress. In response, Jefferson and Madison's faction coalesced under a new banner. They called themselves the Republicans, although today we know them as the Democratic Republican Party. Their name was also a declaration of intent. They saw themselves as the true defenders of the Republic, against the monarchical tendencies of the Federalists. Their creed was Jefferson's. They defended states' rights as a firewall against the tyranny of central power. They advocated for an agrarian society of independent farmers. And in the international arena, their heart was with revolutionary France, the other great republic in the world. And so, the great irony became reality. The Founding Fathers, who scorned the idea of political parties, had created the nation's first party system. Hamilton and Jefferson's personal conflict no longer belonged to them. It had become the engine that would define American politics forever. Creation of political parties was only the beginning. The ideological disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson soon festered. It transformed into a personal, deep, and corrosive hatred. They no longer saw each other as rivals, but as mortal enemies for the soul of America. In his private letters and writings, Jefferson did not mince words. For him, Hamilton was not a mere opponent. He was a monarchist hostile to liberty. He saw him as a corrupt conspirator, a man obsessed with power. He was convinced that Hamilton was secretly recreating the British aristocratic system. He believed that he used the treasury to enrich his speculator friends, and that he was weaving a web of dependency that would strangle the Republic. Every policy of Hamilton was, in his eyes, another brick in the palace of a new king. Hamilton, for his part, returned the contempt with the same intensity. He considered Jefferson a dangerous hypocrite, a Virginia aristocrat, a slave owner who disguised himself as a humble friend of the farmer. He saw him as a fanatic ideologue, a dreamer whose blind faith in the mob and in the bloody French Revolution would lead the country to anarchy. In his writings, Hamilton accused him of being a power-hungry demagogue, a man willing to destroy the nation's stability in order to achieve his goals. This visceral hatred completely poisoned everything. There was no longer any possibility of debate or compromise. Every proposal from the other was seen not as an idea, but as a betrayal. Every argument was a personal attack. Their cabinet meetings, if they even spoke, must have been a spectacle of icy tension. We can imagine the forced greetings in the hallways of Philadelphia, the superficial courtesy hiding absolute contempt. Collaboration had become impossible. The animosity was so great that they could no longer fit in the same room, much less in the same government. Washington's great experiment of a cabinet of rivals had come to a bitter and predictable end. One of the two would have to leave, and Jefferson, feeling increasingly cornered, already knew who it would be. By late 1793, the situation was untenable. Thomas Jefferson, the idealist, felt like a stranger in his own home. He watched as Washington's government adopted one policy after another from his archenemy. Neutrality, the bank, the debt. Each victory for Hamilton was a dagger in the heart of his Republican vision. He was exhausted from fighting battles he always lost. So he made a decision. On December 31st, 1793, he formally submitted his resignation as Secretary of State. It was not a retreat, but a strategic redeployment. He returned to his beloved Monticello, not to retire to a farmer's life, but to become the general in the shadows. From there, far from the capital's control, he could organize the opposition with complete freedom. His departure left Hamilton as the undisputed dominant figure in the cabinet. It seemed he had won the war. But power comes at a price. The constant attacks from the Republican press, congressional investigations, and the sheer fatigue of building a nation from scratch took their toll. Furthermore, there was a much more mundane reason. Hamilton was not a rich man, and his civil servant's salary barely covered his expenses. After having put a country's finances in order, he needed to put his own in order. So, little more than a year after his rival's departure, in January 1795, Alexander Hamilton also submitted his resignation. He returned to New York to reopen his lucrative law firm. The battlefield of Washington's cabinet suddenly lay empty. The two titans who had shaken it for years had left, but no one was fooled. This was not the end of their conflict. It was simply the end of the first act. Now, the war for America's future would be fought openly, across the entire country, and they would be the generals of the armies they had created. The presidential election of 1800 was, to put it bluntly, absolute chaos. The battle was fought with a ferocity never before seen between the Federalists and Jefferson's Republicans. The result was a victory for the Republican side, but with a completely unexpected twist. The electoral system of the time had a monumental design flaw. Each elector cast 2 votes, without distinguishing between president and vice president. The plan was for one Republican elector to abstain from voting for Aaron Burr, Jefferson's running mate, thus ensuring Jefferson came in first. But the plan failed. Party discipline was so perfect that all Republican electors voted for both. The result was an exact tie between Jefferson and Burr. No one had foreseen it. According to the Constitution, the decision now fell to the House of Representatives, a house that, to top it all off, was controlled by the outgoing Federalists. The election was in the hands of Jefferson's sworn enemies. For many Federalists, the temptation was irresistible. They could elect Burr, a man they considered without firm principles, but perhaps more manageable. Or, much better, they could simply block Jefferson's election and plunge the country into chaos. And this is where the story takes a turn that not even the best screenwriter could have written. From New York, Alexander Hamilton watched the situation with horror. He began writing frantic letters to his Federalist colleagues, imploring them to do the unthinkable: vote for Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton's reasoning was a masterpiece of pragmatism. He despised Jefferson, yes, but he considered him a man of principles, even if those were principles he considered dangerous. In contrast, he saw Aaron Burr as an unscrupulous opportunist, a man driven solely by ambition, a much greater threat to the Republic. "If there is one man we ought not to place in the presidency," he wrote, "that is Mr. Burr." Hamilton's campaign worked. After 36 agonizing ballots, enough Federalists abstained, breaking the deadlock. And so Thomas Jefferson became president. The man who had sworn to dismantle Hamilton's system owed his victory, ironically, to the direct intervention of his greatest enemy. Jefferson's victory, ironically sealed by his greatest enemy, was not the end of his war. It was his consecration. Because the true legacy of their conflict was not the victory of one man over another, but the creation of a political system that has endured to this day. Unintentionally, and probably to their horror, these two men had given a gift to their country: the two-party system. What began as their personal factions, the Federalists and the Republicans, became the permanent mold of American politics. The names of the parties would change over time, but the fundamental dynamic, that of two large blocs competing for power, remained forever. Their confrontation also put the most important question of all on the table: how far does the power of the federal government extend? The debate they initiated regarding the interpretation of the Constitution has never ended. Every time today there is a discussion about the economy, healthcare, or states' rights, at its core, the discussion between Hamilton's expansive vision and Jefferson's restrictive vision is being rekindled. And most profoundly of all, their rivalry defined two souls for America that remain in tension. On one side, there is Hamilton's America. It is a nation of commerce, finance, global power, and a strong central government that drives progress. On the other side, there is Jefferson's America. It is a nation of individual liberty, of distrust toward concentrated power, and one that idealizes the independent citizen. In the end, history did not prove one right over the other. It proved both right. The true genius of the system they helped create is not that one vision triumphed, but that the conflict itself became the engine of the nation. American democracy is not a monologue. It is a conversation, often shouted, between the ghost of Hamilton and the spirit of Jefferson. And in that constant tension, in that unstable balance, is where the country has found its way for more than 200 years. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of America's foundational rivalries. We hope you have enjoyed this exploration of the epic confrontation between the visions of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Their opposing ideas not only created the first political parties, but defined a debate about power and liberty that is still alive today. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, we would appreciate it if you liked this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more dives into the stories that shaped our world.